Hey guys, this is Josh with the Adept Ape channel, and in this video we're going to be discussing grease and what is the best grease out there, or at least what I recommend for your application. Now this is good to know whether you have a piece of equipment, whether you have a truck or an RV or a bus, you might have an earth moving piece of equipment, maybe a marine application, and pretty much any heavy duty piece of equipment or on highway vehicle is going to have a lot of grease fittings. And grease is very important because it protects items that are usually not bathed in oil. We're not talking about your engine, we're not talking about your differential, we're not talking about your transmission outside of your clutch. So pretty much everything else, if it's lubricated, it's going to be grease lubricated. I want to make a video discussing what my opinion and what some opinions out there on grease are, what I like the best, and maybe what you should be using, okay? So when I was in the power generation side at Caterpillar, there was not a lot of greased components. The rear bearing on a generator, some of them are greased, some of them are sealed. The fan drive might be greased. Outside of that, there's not a lot of grease components, at least on the power gen side. And when I moved into the truck shop, I remember the first time I had to lube a chassis, and I remember thinking, holy crap, there is a lot of grease fittings on a heavy-duty truck. I mean, you have the front suspension, which you have multiple grease points for all the steering components, the suspension components. Then each brake has its own grease. You have the slack adjuster gets greased, the S-cam gets greased, the throwout bearing, the clutch fork shafts need greased. You have your U-joints, all of them get greased, your spline shaft for the drive shaft, the stub shaft between the differentials, all the brakes in the rear get greased. There's a lot of greased parts, and if any of them either have not been greased in a long time, so the grease failed, those components are going to break, and they're expensive, and they could down your truck or your RV or your piece of equipment. Equipment as well, ton of grease fittings on them, okay? So let's talk about which grease you should be using. So there's of course a ton of greases out there, and the most common ones are lithium complex greases. But I used to use those a lot, and I switched over to something called a calcium sulfonate style grease. And the reason for that is I started doing research as to what the best styles of grease were, and most of that came from a website called Machine Lubrication. I'm going to show you a spreadsheet that they made that kind of led me to why I started using a calcium sulfonate style grease, okay? Now, I didn't make this spreadsheet. This comes from machinerylubrication.com, and they made this spreadsheet. And if you look at it, on the top it has lithium multipurpose grease, lithium complex, and calcium sulfonate grease. And if you look at every single property outside of the very bottom where it says compatibility with lithium greases, if you exclude that one, every single property is better with a calcium sulfonate grease. Now, the calcium sulfonate, remember, is not the oil of the grease. It's not doing the lubrication. It's what encases the oil that lubricates. Now, the base gives the grease its property, and the base is the lithium or the calcium sulfonate. So you can see it's better in high temperatures. It has better stability. It has better water resistance. It operates better under temperature and extreme pressures. So overall, it's just a much heavier duty grease. Now, of course, you can use a heavier duty grease on a lighter duty component, but you don't want to use a lighter duty grease on a heavy duty component. Now, just like engine oils, there's tons of different manufacturers that make grease out there. Now, I work at a Cat dealer, and they have their own brand of grease, so of course that's what I was using. I'm not claiming the Cat makes the best greases, but they do make very good high quality greases. So out of the ones they make, I decided to pick the best one that suited my application. So I went through the specifications that Cat has, and they have this spreadsheet on their parts.cat website. And you can see on the bottom, it's determined by load and temperature. And I wanted to pick the heaviest duty load capabilities at the highest temperature, because that'll give you pretty much the best high quality use and longest lasting grease. And it'll show you the little moly content and the operating ranges. And I selected Desert Gold at first, and then I switched to the Cat Extreme Application Grease number 2. So as you can see from that spreadsheet, the calcium sulfonate greases are much better for pretty much all applications. Now, there are specialized greases for, let's say, very high-speed bearings, very high temperatures, maybe a very specific application. We're not going to focus on very specific applications. We're looking at basically general greases that you could use on maybe your whole truck or your RV. So, as I already said, I'm a fan of calcium sulfonate greases because of pretty much they operate much better than the lithium complex ones. Now, the lithium complex ones are much easier to use. Now, what do I mean by that? Their viscosity seems lower. So if you're using a hand-style grease gun, they're much easier to pump, and when you change cartridges, it's much easier to prime them. Priming a calcium sulfonate grease cartridge can be a major pain in the butt, even as someone that greases a lot. There's tricks to getting it to prime, but man, especially when in a cold condition or cooler conditions, they're very hard to prime. But when they are primed and you're greasing appropriately, the calcium sulfonate grease is going to give you much better protection on all your components, and it should last longer than the lithium complex ones. Also, it mixes well with lithium, although typically if you're going to be greasing your own components, you want to use one style grease and keep using that style grease. You don't want to mix and match. They're not all compatible all the time. So what grease do I use on the trucks and buses and RVs that come into the shop? Well, when I first started, I used to use the lightest duty lithium complex grease they had. And the reason for that was when I was starting out, I hated greasing stuff and I hated priming the grease gun with the heavier duty greases. And a lot of truck shops use a lighter duty grease with pretty much no moly content. Now, moly is, and I'm going to try and say this correctly, molybdenum, which is hard to say. I used to call it molybdenum, but apparently that is not correctly how you pronounce it. It is molybdenum. And it's a very fine particle, and it's the same stuff that you use on head bolts and main bolts typically when you're installing them, and it's a very fine lubricant. Now, when I started really looking into grease, I was like, okay, I need to start using a higher quality grease. So I switched to the Desert Gold because I live on the West Coast in a very hot climate. And the Desert Gold is really great for hot climates. It's very thick. It does not really melt just at room temperature. It doesn't, it's very thick. Now, the problem with that is it is very, very hard to prime. And it has a 5% moly content. And about a year ago, I switched over to the Cat Extreme number 2 with an NLGN or GI content number 2, which is a little bit thinner consistency than the Desert Gold, but it's also very heavy duty. It has about the same protective factors as the Desert Gold. It's just a little bit lower temperature rated. So I switched to that because it has very good protection and it's a little bit easier to use than the straight up Desert Gold. Desert Gold is a great grease though if you're going to be in hot environments. Now, of course, maybe you're in a very cold environment, so you don't want to use that. Please look for what the temperature range is for your equipment. Maybe you want to use the Arctic Platinum instead of the Desert Gold, or maybe you don't want to use the super heavy duty because let's say you're just doing fifth wheels and you're just greasing them. You don't really need super high duty moly content for that. Now, the moly content is very good for pretty much all bearings, bushings, U-joints, but tapered roller bearings, there's some controversy on those, and that's mostly for bearings on hubs. Now, a lot of truck bearings, of course, they're wet baths, so they have oil in them. But lighter duty ones and trailers sometimes are greased. And a tapered roller bearing, sometimes when you use moly, they'll skid because they actually lubricate so well. So a lot of the times, manufacturers will recommend not using any sort of moly-based grease if you're doing wheel hubs with grease. But check with each manufacturer for the specific correct type of grease and whether you can use any sort of moly content in that style grease, okay? So that's my video on grease. I hope you learned at least a little bit about grease and what my opinions are on the correct style greases, and hopefully using the correct style greases, and if you start greasing stuff yourself, hopefully it will last longer than relying on other people to grease your components, okay? Thanks for watching.